afternoon. Welcome to another SmartQA Musings, a gentle flurry of interesting thoughts. And today, I want to muse about the role of AI in the context of layered assurance. I want to put the layered assurance first and then talk about how could AI be of assistance to us. So I will treat it in two parts. Probably the first initial few minutes, kind of talk about a little bit and what do I really mean by layered assurance, and then spend some time and maybe share some ideas on the role of AI. We all know that assurance, we obviously have a plan, we do a few things, but it's not just about executing a plan, which I think we are well aware of. It is about, in some sense, engaging with depth, purpose, context to ultimately find issues and deliver higher value, right? And do it as efficiently as possible to as minimally as possible. So we know that systems are complex, and therefore, obviously, the act of assurance is also complex. And one of the well-known approaches to solving complexity is layering, the act of onion peeling. That is, we don't see the entire system, we see it in various layers or different abstractions, and therefore end up simplifying the problem, getting a better handle on what we're doing, and therefore being able to do a better job. So now, how can we think about layers in the context of assurance? Right? We can think about it in many, many ways. We can think about the way we think itself about assurance. Is it checking? Is it finding something new? Is it questioning? And so on. So we'll talk about that. It's also about what are we trying to assure or probe? Are we looking at individual smaller entities like screens and features and APIs? Are we looking at larger flows? Are we looking at fully integrated systems spanning across a whole bunch of systems and therefore business flows? So that could be another. It could also be the elements that we integrate. It's not just my code. I have my code. It sits in an environment. It uses other systems. And ultimately, it works in different marketplaces. So the elements that we integrate is another layer. And when we move away from the notion of the activity or input kind of a layer, or how we think, what entities or elements, we can think in terms of types of issues. What kind of issues are we looking at? Are there different layers of issues, simple cosmetic ones, simple data handling ones, to complex business flow and attribute sense? And then going further, we can also look at it from the act of the probes, that is, the test cases, the scenarios, and something more than just scenarios and probes, which I would prefer to call as the notion of probes. So it can be very specific, it can be very broad. And finally, what do we have as outcome? Is it just bugs? Or is it something more? So when you look at the entire assurance, we can see that it is an interesting onion peel of a variety of different things. And therefore, it is about multiple layers and multiple viewpoints. And then later, what we want to do is to see if I layerize this problem, can AI help me better? Because I have a little more sharpness in terms of what I deal with, and therefore, can it enable me to do? Not necessarily replace for my thinking, but certainly enable me to think and therefore do better. That's the context. This is what we talked about very briefly. So you have to put it down as a picture. It is many dimensions of layer. It's not a single dimension. It is the mental approach, the purpose and the issues of what we're looking at, the entity, and so on and so forth. So let's take maybe a few minutes to kind of look at each one of them in its detail. So what do we mean by one of the layers, which I have titled as approach here? Now, the approach is how I look at the act of assurance. What is my mental approach? Is it about repeating something, regressing something? Or is it going all the way into looking at ideas on the other extreme? So when you look at the way we probably all approach the act of assurance, we certainly have certain things that we repeat consistently. We regress a few things, we constantly check a few things, and then as we go forward, we start checking and confirming, is it according to spec, and so on and so forth. And then you start looking at it more from an interrogative style, questioning, discovering, and then further on, you say, look, I go all the way out. I'm exploring and finally becoming ideating, right? So we start from one spectrum of a diligent doing, which more often becomes automated, to the other extreme spectrum of smart ideating, which results in some interesting ideas. And in between, we have these various layers. So that's one way to think of the notion of layer in the context of how my approach would be at an overall piece. So what does it help? How does it help us? Because it makes our intentions much more clearer. It does not see it as a bunch of tasks. It moves it from a notion of an activity to do to a purpose that we want to accomplish. Right? So that's one layer, so to speak, from one point of view. Right? The second is in a purpose in a slightly different manner. It's the purpose in terms of, okay, let me sharpen and say, what kind of issues am I looking for? Is it only issues, first of all? And if it is, what kind of issues? And therefore, we know there are different kinds of issues. There could be simple ones like data handling, data validation, data formats, and so on. It could be some formatting in terms of front ends, data formats, and so on. So it could be cosmetic, the arrangement of data, the arrangement of inputs, the arrangement of how I interface with humans or other machines. It could then turn out to be functional. Obviously, that's the basic behavior. And then it could turn out to be largely systemic. It's not just about functions, it's about attributes. And then going further around, issues related to the whole, the deployment. And finally, the issues related to, does it really add value? So this particular layered notion of assurance, where we are focusing on the layer of purpose with respect to issues, is about being very sensitive to the quality of issues, right? It's not just about quantity or number or issues per se. We're looking at it from some. Therefore, testing is really not about just uncovering issues or hindrance. I think we are really going all the way to see if we can actually deliver meaningful value. I'm sure we have values at different stuff. One value would be to prevent. One value would be to deliver something significantly better so that we can maybe sell applications or products better. So there are business values, technical values that we're talking about. The other layer would be in the context of the what. What are we testing? So can we break down the system into smaller pieces like components, to features which compose components, to requirements, which is a composition of features, and therefore, finally, of course, ending up with flow. So we might end up having probes and scenarios and so on and so forth across these various entity layers. So what are we trying to accomplish here? To be clear of what you're testing, moving away from system point of view only to an end-to-end business standpoint of view, right? For after all, at the end of the day, SmartQA is not just about testing. It is about seeking clarity, right? So having gone from the notion of entities, what are the other layers? Remember, we talked about the notion, it's not just my code. My code lives in an environment. We may connect to other systems and therefore have system integration. And our systems may be used in different market segments by different classes of users. So the idea, this particular layer is alluding to the idea of the system layer or the various elements that ultimately make up my larger system, which is not just my code. So I am validating my code in different environments for different systems. And therefore, I'm seeing my part, which is good parts, and I'm ensuring my parts are good, but I'm consistently aware and focused on, am I a great whole, right? The next type of layer would be in terms of how we move from the what, from elements and from entities to elements, and then it's kind of the how. And here we are saying testing is not about monolithic piece of finding issues. It is about fine test cases to broad ideas to figuring out how to come up with elements that I would test with increasing abstraction. The idea of a layered test design from being very specific to something strategic. And therefore, the idea in the intent is deeper the insight implies, the broader the design lens. So when we talk about the fact that there is test cases and scenarios or whatever, we are talking about the idea of a design which is much more sharper, not as broad, right? It's focused, it's specific. But then if you say, I'm probably going to look for this criteria, look for these issues, look for certain approaches and ideas, we are expanding it. You might deem it exploratory to use the word, but then the idea here is we are expanding the whole idea. And finally, of course, is the results layer. So we went from the mental aspect or the approach aspect to the what, to the how. Now we're talking about the outcomes and results. Is it just about catching bugs? Not necessarily. The contribution may be many levels. We can ultimately look at it not just as bugs. It can be asking interesting questions, giving interesting suggestions, offering insights, and ultimately shifting the people the way we think about quality and therefore doing it far better. So the most powerful outcomes are not just defects. They are really reflections that we have from the way we do things, and that if it can ripple across the individual, the team, and the organization, obviously we become significantly smarter. And the nicest part about this entire piece is we have an ally today in the role of an AI, which can help us in each of these various things because we have broken down the pieces. So let's take a look at each one of them and what the role of AI could possibly be. So if you look at and ask, hey, how can I have an approach where I regress, where I check, where I question, where I explore, where I probably come up with ideas? Could AI help? That's the question. Some are fairly straightforward, right? So we can say, look, maybe I can use AI today to automate the checks. I can convert them into standard checks. Maybe I can even automate that into whatever tool. And therefore, the repetition part and the confirmation part, certainly today we know, and we probably use the idea to come up with automated test cases, sometimes even design of test cases, design of early stage probes, if you will. Now, when you look at interrogation, exploration, ideation, the probes need to change. You can't just have test cases. You're asking questions. You're doing something more than just looking at spec, right? And that is where the next question is, can AI help me come up with interesting questions? Can it help me explore? Can it help me come up with ideas? One way to look at it is, if I have broken down the problem into more smaller layers, then I can certainly ask more interesting questions like, hey, what kind of issues are probable in this kind of an entity, in this kind of environment, for this kind of a market? And therefore, I can use this idea in the context of interrogation to do a few things, to maybe design test cases, maybe to assess the quality of test, to understand something better, to hypothesize, and so on. And the other ones is, if I have got prior baselines and I have got various outputs, I can give these outputs and ask the system to learn what could be certain outputs in different situations, and therefore help it to not just test by simple comparison. It can actually use learned baselines, understand variations, and therefore validate better. So that is in terms of the confirmation piece, right? If I have a piece of code, then I can probably use today, which I'm sure there are tools today, which allow you to go and look at code, allow you to analyze the way the code works, figure out some dependency graphs, and use the structural aspect of the code along with an intelligence of AI to construct. And I think there are tools to do that. The other one could be variations in terms of generating differential variations of data, which could be used as a mutant to find unknown areas validate test cases, and certainly model behaviors, extracting conditions. The last one, the last kind of an idea could be even looking at patterns of defects. So if I've got a defect stream that I've uncovered, maybe using the idea to kind of analyze a little more intelligently rather than just statistically what kind of defects have been found, when have they been found, how, where have they been found, and therefore learning from there, and then therefore ideating something interesting. So what we're trying to look at it at a much more higher level of saying, if I have obviously have different approaches to validating, starting from simple repetition to going all the way to exploration ideation, and we're really saying, could I use AI in these kinds of stuff? Some tools exist, some it's going to be your ability to come up with interesting prompts if you're using a Gen AI system. Some could be pure ML kind of an AI. What does it help in? How does it help? It actually helps us to support a higher and a better cognitive load by enhancing focus, by enabling diversity of thought, and helping us understand more significant variation. And it can help in plain vanilla regression to all the way to coming up with completely something interesting. So move to the next kind of a layer and ask, okay, we understood there are probably different kinds of issues. Could be simple issues like data going on to cosmetic and functional and so on and so forth. So how can it help me? What can it do? Can it help me find? And therefore, can it assist in suggesting types of issues? So if I given a particular specification and then say, hey, these are the kinds of stuff it does, can it give me potential problems that this functional issues that could be there? Can it give me some standard issues that I should look for? Could it warn me that in this situation, it could probably be performance-wise difficult, which could span across all the various elements of this particular layer of data cosmetic? Can I extract certain conditions of behavior given a user story, for example, or given some kind of a specification, and therefore can it help me ideate scenarios of behavior, be it at the early stage of functionality or a later stage of integration with other systems, which could be non-functional aspects. So could it be, for example, in the act of design? Right. So what is it helping me with? It is helping me with the ability to hypothesize what could be potential problems, and help me come up with certain scenarios that could possibly be helpful to find. Or remember, we can also flip it a little differently, which we will talk later, analytics. So if I had a bunch of defects, I could classify it into these levels, and also interesting set of analytics, which we will cover a bit later. Right. Now, when you look at the layer of entity, where we said we could test something in the small component, maybe it's a screen, maybe it's an API, maybe it's a library, and therefore it's a building block. It's like a component. You can go all the way to testing a feature or a requirement or a flow. So it's not just we are testing something, we are kind of asking ourselves, what are we testing? And then trying to do this job. So we are saying, how can it help here? Maybe, can I help it to decompose a system? So if somebody gives me a bunch of user stories, can I say, hey, what do you think are certain features here, and what do you think are interesting flows I should look forward? So can it help me to kind of understand and set the context in terms of, hey, here are some of these at lower levels of entities, and here are some higher level entities, and therefore can it help decompose the system and sharpen the clarity? That's part one. The part two is, okay, I have entities. Maybe it's a feature or requirement expressed as a specification, user story, whatever. But maybe it has some criteria of acceptance. Maybe it has some conditions that are there, which are behaviors. Maybe there are personas that it's supposed to be useful to. Now, can I interrogate that using AI, for example, to prove and sharpen the criteria and therefore aid in testability. Right? So the second part. The third part is obviously understanding the larger context of expectation. Given a spec at whatever level, can I appropriately come up with interesting prompts to help me understand potential expectations for those persona in those markets broadly and deeply, and therefore help me in ideating usage scenarios, behavior scenarios, potential interactions, so that I can be a little more smarter when it comes to regression, if I'm not automated some of those regression test cases, right? So what I'm trying to kind of get to is the fact that if I am able to slice and dice the system from various points of view into various layers, I can possibly question better. And since I have at recourse to me a good AI system, maybe it allows me to come up with better questions, cleaner questions. But, that simply means sharper, cleaner, specific prompts to help me find some things, help me think about a few things, help me suggest a few things, rather than just put a very broad prompt. Because a broad prompt is not very, very useful, because it gives me a lot of information and then it probably derails me, right? And that's where I think the layering helps. And when you look at layers across these various points of view, various dimensions, then the ability to sharpen and have this intelligent system or intelligent assistant to help me becomes far better. Right? Moving in from the entities and the elements, it just kind of builds along the notion that I have to look at it from environment and look at it from, because I may not be just my system. I may be using another system which I connect with. Maybe I'm using a payment gateway. Maybe I'm using some of the workflow systems. I'm using maybe another CRM or a financial system. So my entire solution may not be just my code, right? So I have to really look at it from how do I bridge my scope with the larger scope with the ecosystem dynamics, because there are other systems. It has certain formats, certain rates, certain expectations, differential versions, and so on, right? So I'm trying to kind of use the AI to help me understand how can I bridge my scope in the larger ecosystem and therefore do a better job, and therefore maybe help me in improving or coming up and enhancing my strategy, my scope, my plan. The second thing is to also look at it and say, okay, if that environment changed, what could I be affected? So some kind of an hypothesis, some kind of a understanding analysis could be some part static, some part dynamic. The intent being impact of change of an environment, impact of change of an external system, impact of a change in a deployment model. How can I use AI to ask questions in a very pointed fashion to help me figure it out? Because not all of them will be written. And of course, we will explore, but this is an aid to the act of exploration. Now, if I have well-formed contracts, if I say, okay, here is it between these two systems, this is the contract. So maybe I can use the idea of that contract and give that contract to an AI as a prompt and help me figure out how to go about what kind of scenarios that I could possibly come up establishing some contracts, right? Maybe there is a complex environment and we've got a bunch of environments. We want to know how to optimize the combination of environments. So maybe I could also maybe afford to use a Gen AI today to figure out certain optimized versions of environments, maybe even prompting what kind of environments are more probable, understanding, and then of course combining. And the last and the final one in terms of end users and markets could be, there could be various personas in a complex enterprise system. So what do they want? How do they use? What are some interesting situations they encounter? Quite obviously is not readily available within our own realm. So sometimes using that assistant and using that AI-based assistant kind of stuff to be able to say, what do people do? How do people do? What kind of problems have you seen in the past? And therefore, gaining some knowledge from the collective intelligence of the larger context could help us come up with specific, segment-specific paths to test. So, so the role of AI in the context of the larger context of elements, which is about the larger environments and the connected systems and the markets itself, is about bridging the scope with the largest ecosystem dynamics. Now, coming back, going in from the what, we're moving into the how, so to speak, and then they're really saying, hey, if it is test cases and scenarios, it's nice, but from the high-based methodology of SmartQA, I prefer to use the word called probe, where I say probe is something that I perturb the system with to find an issue. It could be a very specific case or a scenario, or it could be a little more broader like a criteria. It could be more broader like an idea, right? And therefore, we're really saying, if I knew that my probe can be sharp and specific to broad, how can I use AI to help me design probes? And therefore, it's about what kind of questions can I ask? What kind of prompts can I put, which could result in specific cases to start with, which I will refine, some interesting scenarios, which I will refine, some interesting criteria that I could discover by a process of interrogation or sharpen that criteria, and then obviously come up with certain checklists as appropriate for criteria, for issues. All these are the active role of AI in probes, which is something that we do have as part of our do SmartQA tool that we have been trying to build over the years. The other one, when it comes to issues, hypothesizing potential issues, assistance by playing around with the AI system to come with new ideas. But remember, in all these things, we are using it as not as a replacement of our thinking. It is more from helping us to do a job better. Now, going into the final segment here in terms of outcomes. So what do we get? We get, we get outcomes. Actually, I think the one that is up here is wrong. I think the outcomes is basically, is it bugs? Is it something else? Is what we're talking about, right? So when we talk about outcomes, what we're really saying is, am I learning from some of those issues in terms of analytics, in terms of what kind of issues am I finding? Am I finding those right issues? What kind of issues am my customer finding? What types of issues? It's not the number. It's really the type of issues, which is what we talked about as the type of the layer as in terms of issues, right? And then, of course, looking at it from what kind of analytics, how can I clarify, how can I know more by asking more questions about outcomes, and then finally stitching certain patterns of issues and therefore refining subsequent test cases, so to speak, right? Remember the test case scenario, this is kind of wrong. I think that's not intended. I think it's a typo from my side. It should have been defects, suggestions, observations, ideas. That's what it should have been, but I'm sorry about that. So finally, when we become layer aware, and therefore when we start using AI assistants, which is now also AI aware, then what it does not just simply do or assist. It amplifies our thinking. It amplifies our work that we can end up doing. Amplify what? Initially, the first thing that we talk about, as you can see, it amplifies the cognitive sharpness, because we are asking more specific, more meaningful, more interesting questions in a particular layer, and some of them being specific, some of them could be broader. It could improve the cognitive sharpness and therefore help us to understand better. Certainly, it allows us to be a little more sharper in terms of precision of what we do. But precision can be a two-edged sword, right? Because we can having very sharp and precise scenarios and cases, and we also need broader ways to look at things. But if everything is broad, then the precision is compromised. So you also need certain precision. So when we become much more sharper in terms of what kind of issues am I looking for, in where, in which element, for what market segment, from which persona, and so on and so forth, then naturally the way I approach it, be it design, be it scoping, be it automating, be it analysis, becomes much better. The conversations that we have among us could become much more sensible because our understanding is better. Hopefully our clarity is much better, and therefore the conversations are richer. And finally, of course, the entire intent is to have a larger business impact, moving away from the notion of act of a doer, an executor, a designer, or automator, to somebody who to be able to have an impact in doing things hopefully a little more better in the beginning, to help come up with a richer set of ideas. So it's not just about validation and testing, but co-creation in the context of development, in the context of building applications, and certainly, of course, the impact to our customers and the business of our customers, right? And what it fundamentally means is it helps us to go deeper, it helps us to go faster, it helps us to be more insightful. And to me, the key idea of for the musing here is, it is not just about using AI, it is about having a well-formed onion peel so that I can ask meaningful prompts which are sensible, which allow me to do my job better. Otherwise, it will turn out to be broad prompts and loose answers.